Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Spotlight podcast episode brought to you by the Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Eliza Urwin, Head of Research here at the CCDP. Joining me today is Keith Krause, Director of the CCDP, and Howard Shatz, a Senior Economist at Randa Corporation. Today's Spotlight looks at a workshop that took place in Geneva on October 9th, focusing on Ukraine Reconstruction. The CCDP was fortunate to collaborate with the Rand Corporation and with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Ukraine office to host the event, which was generously sponsored by the Swiss FDFA. The workshop explored how to address current economic challenges and post-war reconstruction in Ukraine. We had an impressive turnout with around 25 experts and officials. The discussions were both in-depth and wide-ranging, and in today's episode, we're going to highlight some of the key points discussed and the main conclusions drawn from the event. Keith and Howard both played key roles. Without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome, Keith and Howard. Can you start off by each telling me a little bit about yesterday's workshop, Keith? Maybe your general impressions and any key points or discussions that particularly resonated with you.
Sure. I think the main purpose of the workshop was to bridge a couple of gaps. And the first gap is between the high level and policymaker discussion, and the second is the expert level discussions. And it was very clear that there's often quite divergent perceptions about what's possible in both the short and the medium term on that. And I think that's probably one of the most important lessons from this is how to think about bridging that gap.
That's exactly right. And in the other population there was also the practitioner level. So we had a good number of people who had experience on the ground. And a number of really useful points came out of that, which is the policymaker level was quite well attuned to what would it take to get a good policy through. The research level and the practitioner level was more, what are the current needs? What really needs to be done? And that's the gap, I think, that was most important, is how do you get done what you need to get done? And how do you make it palatable to policymakers?
And Howard, can I ask you, I understand that you and the Rand Corporation were integral to the genesis of this workshop. Can you tell me a little bit about how it came to be?
Sure. Well, I have a senior colleague, or had, Ambassador Jim Dobbins, who originally had worked very extensively in Europe, was instrumental in facilitating the reunification of Germany, and then was our ambassador to the European community and our assistant secretary of state for European affairs. After that, he started working in conflict zones, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Afghanistan. And then he came to Rand and he spearheaded a series of reports on nation building. So when he looked at the discussion on Ukraine reconstruction, he saw certain gaps, and he put together a team. And the big gaps were, what were the right models? What should we think about when we think about Ukraine reconstruction? In his view, we really should think about the 75-year history of Europe's post-war reconstruction, recovery, and reintegration. And the other point that he saw that was missing was that security is going to be integral to reconstruction. In all of these events, there were security agreements, security provisions, not only to prevent war, but also to give investors confidence. Regrettably, Jim died in July, but he was really quite active in the writing of this report and lived long enough to see it published. So he was the inspiration for us. And then we managed to team up with CCDP at the Graduate Institute, and were able to produce this workshop.
Let me pick up on that point. I think one of the key things that the CCDP works on is post-conflict peace building. And our perception is that it's very integrally wrapped up with issues of state building and nation building, and that there are some lessons to be learned, maybe even negative lessons from previous experiences, both the historical ones of Europe and also around the world for reconstruction in Ukraine. I think it was also very helpful to have partnered with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, who has an office in Ukraine that is working specifically on these. So it was a very nice tripartite collaboration.
Keith, can you tell us a little bit about what we learned yesterday?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways was that coordination is very difficult. I might think it's going to be impossible going forward, both coordination between and among the donors, coordination among the different stakeholder groups, whether it's economic, social, or more political aspects. And of course, working very closely with Ukrainians themselves, who are the primary drivers of this process. I think a second big takeaway for me was that if you look at this holistically, there are some really big choke points or roadblocks in this process. You can pour all the money you want into Ukraine, but if you don't have the material, the know-how, the labor, the resources, things aren't going to happen. So it is not just a question of money.
Howard?
One of the points that kept arising yesterday was that, and we had to be reminded of this, is that Ukraine is still a society at war, and it's quite a vicious war. So we have very high expectations for what Ukrainians and what the Ukrainian government should do, but this is a war for national survival, so there are limits. We also learned that it's important to have some on-the-ground knowledge. So, for example, mine removal is going to be extremely important for post-war reconstruction. It's not exciting. You don't, as a donor, you don't get to tell all your potential contributors that you remove mines, but it's really fundamental. At the same time, we have to define, well, there's an area where we might suspect there are mines, but are there really mines? It does make a difference. We don't want to put a lot of money into exploring an area where there aren't mines, and that even affects the population in Ukraine. So there's really important on-the-ground knowledge that has to be gained. Reconstruction is also not just about buildings, infrastructure, bridges, roads, right? There's going to be a social reconstruction also. And this could be a very damaged society with many men having served in the war and coming back affected by that service in some way. And then internally displaced people and refugees returning and not necessarily returning to their homes, but having to start a new life as Ukraine restarts as a functioning nation.
You mentioned the long-term impacts of, for example, men being on the front lines for so long. And a few of the participants discussed some of the more gendered aspects of the impact on the economy and the impact on social structures in Ukraine. Can one of you speak to some of those points that were raised yesterday?
Yeah, I think there's two issues that are very important here. The first is that during the actual conflict period, you have women and children principally, but not exclusively, who are displaced and refugees, and men who are serving in the front line. And we know from previous conflicts that creates massive social dislocation, both within households and families, but also within communities when they return. The second is that the labor force needs to be mobilized. To mobilize women in the workforce, you also need to have a suitable social safety net of some sort, perhaps not elaborate and full-scale creches and schools and so on, but decent social protection, healthcare, and other forms of support. And those are, of course, not on the high-level agendas of people who are talking about large-scale infrastructure reconstruction, but they're absolutely crucial to moving forward.
Keith had mentioned that many of the displaced and refugees were women and children. This adds another challenge for reconstruction in that many of these women are finding jobs in Europe, in Berlin and Warsaw, and they're finding schools for their children. They're rebuilding their lives. And it's really an open question as to whether they'll return to Ukraine after a settlement or whether they'll attract their partners or the men who fought out of Ukraine. And this will be another challenge for Ukraine reconstruction.
How do you guys think might this workshop inform or steer ongoing or future initiatives related to Ukraine's reconstruction?
Thank you. It can provide guidance along a number of dimensions. First of all, it raised a number of questions which still have to be answered to the satisfaction not only of researchers, but of practitioners. And that's really what we're aiming at. The first thing is what kinds of skills, what kinds of tools, what expertise, and what regulations will Ukraine need for successful reconstruction? The second big issue is Ukraine is going to be an accession country for the European Union, but fulfilling EU requirements might in some ways be incompatible with successful reconstruction, especially in the early stages. So how do we make those two courses of action compatible? Third is, we talked about when should reconstruction start, and it's still uncertain. How much reconstruction or recovery can you do during wartime? And make no mistake, we're still in wartime in Ukraine. And then we also want to build financial flexibility into reconstruction funding. We don't want the funding rules to be so strict that they don't really match the needs. There's another big area. Reconstruction, especially financing of reconstruction, will depend crucially on private sector interests. Historically, we've seen that even though a lot of discussion is about aid, and aid is very important for taking on risk and building confidence, most of the money will come from the private sector. So the private sector really needs to be much better integrated into reconstruction planning and has to have confidence that its investments will not be destroyed and that there will be a payoff for it in some way.
And there are a couple of other areas that I think are parallel to that. The first is that private sector investment is also complemented by, let's call it, informal sector flows, both from the diaspora, from individuals, and from others. And we know in other contexts that those private flows are often more important than official assistance. So how to actually ensure that these are all moving in the same direction or not duplicating efforts or contradicting each other is going to be a big challenge. And I think that we don't have a clear picture for that. On the other level, we know that Ukraine has been working hard, sometimes with success, to deal with issues associated with corruption. And this is also going to be something going forward that will be very important, because huge inflows of resources create also huge opportunities. And we know from other experiences that this is a really big challenge in post-war reconstruction efforts, and it creates dilemmas for some of the donors. On the donor front, it's also clear that flexibility is crucial, but they're very bad at giving it. And I think that how we can build in as much flexibility as possible to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances for reconstruction and needs that are identified only down the road is going to be a very big challenge. And all of this is not really on the high level agendas of the policymakers, who are focusing much more on the big headlines and the big projects and the big numbers, but getting it down to that working level and getting the real research needed to inform these actual concrete programmatic decisions is going to be a big challenge.
I'm curious to know, how would you guys assess the current efforts of the Swiss government, the US government, and the EU regarding Ukraine reconstruction?
Well, I think the Swiss have actually taken some very innovative steps towards this. First off, they have a clear strategy. They have, as was articulated yesterday, a clear vision of what kind of elements are needed, both the private sector, as has been mentioned, dealing with corruption, dealing with coordination, and coming up with a strong and binding plan. So I think they have a clear vision. I think they're also going to put in place next year a legal framework for this, which is distinct and dealing with Ukraine reconstruction, and also a 10-year financing facility. So this is actually something that many other donor countries could look at positively. On the negative side, Switzerland and a few other significant donors are kind of on the margins of some of the existing coordination mechanisms with the G7 and the EU and so on. And that, of course, is already something that needs to be addressed. Everybody has to be working together and rowing in the same direction. But I think the Swiss are also trying to address that.
So if we look at the U.S. effort, the U.S. made a very positive step recently with the appointment of a reconstruction coordinator, Penny Pritzker, former Secretary of Commerce. That's a good step, and she will feed into the coordination platform and reach back to the private sector. It's not clear how much budget authority she has, and that's very important. Is we want a reconstruction coordinator with some budget authority, ability to move money around and command actions by the other departments. The U.S. also has been very generous with funding, but the funding is uncertain. And so we need a bit more funding certainty. Where we have been good on the political level is U.S. leadership has emphasized the importance of Ukraine and of Ukraine reconstruction. Where it could improve is to strengthen a bipartisan effort. It's interesting. We look back at the Marshall Plan, and everyone has praise for the Marshall Plan. It wasn't at all certain that the Marshall Plan would be approved by Congress or the Senate. There was a serious bipartisan effort, not only within Congress and the Senate, but also to explain to the American people the importance of this. And so that can certainly be improved on the U.S. side. For the rest of the countries, we really do need full-time coordinators, both in the capitals and on the ground. Eventually, we're going to need full-time coordinators on the ground in touch with Ukrainian ministries and the Ukrainian government. There should also be kind of a rebalancing more towards grants. So the new EU 50 billion euro facility over 4 years, the 4 years is very good because it gives some certainty, but it's mostly in the form of loans. Eventually, those loans are unlikely to be paid back in full. And that could cause other problems. So it needs to be tilted much more towards grants. For countries as a group, war risk insurance has been raised both in the Lugano Recovery Conference and in the London Recovery Conference, but we haven't made much progress on that. So it would be very good to see war risk insurance instituted to protect investors, as well as more clarity on insurance for shipments of grain out of Ukraine's ports.
Last question for you both. Do you have any advice for the German government as it prepares for the URC next year?
All right. Well, we have a recovery conference coming up in Germany next year. And at this stage in the war and in the efforts at coordinating reconstruction, I think it would be very good if we worked towards a number of specific outcomes. It would be very good to see specific list of investments in recovery that would be appropriate both for wartime and for post-war reconstruction. So we don't want the investment to be destroyed, but there are going to be some things that will be helpful in both situations. And not only would we like to see that, but we'd like to see concrete commitments by the countries at the recovery conference. And those commitments should be mostly grants, not loans. It would be absolutely terrific if each of the countries assembled announced or had already designated their Ukraine reconstruction coordinators. Another issue that should be made sure that we see that at the recovery conference is, as Keith said, to see all donor countries integrated into the coordination platform. And finally, earlier, Keith had referred to corruption as an issue. We're going to, at some point, want some kind of inspector general mechanism. And defining that early on to give investors confidence would be very helpful, as well as to give donors confidence. And that inspector general should have access to data. There should be coordination between Ukraine authorities and whatever inspector general there is. So defining that to come out of Berlin would be very helpful.
I want to close on a couple of other thoughts here, which is we really need to think about this from the Ukrainian perspective right now. There are basic needs and survival needs, but in any reconstruction phase, the key priorities are going to be housing, basic infrastructure of water, sanitation, sewage, roads, basic services that go along with that, much of which requires investment and being built up in telecommunications and so forth. Some of these things provide opportunities to leapfrog into new generations. Some of them will have to face the fact that there are some profound inequalities in Ukraine between different regions, between urban and rural, and that those will need to be addressed if you want to have a healthy, vibrant, and secure democracy emerging from this. And this is a much longer term perspective. And I hope that the reconstruction efforts and the reconstruction conferences don't lose sight of the need to avoid overloading the Ukrainians with demands and resources, but also running roughshod over what their own priorities are for social, political, and economic reconstruction. And I think there's a lot of goodwill, but we need to make sure that that's carried forward in a sensible way.
Thank you, Howard and Keith, for your valuable insights. As we wrap up, I'd also like to say a special thanks to Abdullah Ibrahim and to Brianna Faith Elder for their preparation, both editing and preparing for this podcast, as well as all the work that they did organizing this workshop. To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and until next time.